Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The sentence of death was the last sound to reach my ears. After that, the voices merged into one dreamy, indistinguishable hum. Then presently I heard no more, and I felt that my senses were leaving me. Yet, for a while I saw, but with such terrible distortion, I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me white and thin, even to grotesqueness, thin with the expression of stern contempt of human torture. I saw their lips twisted with lethal judgments. I saw them form the syllables of my name, and I shuddered when no sound followed. I saw, too, for a few moments of delirious horror, the nearly imperceptible movement of the draperies which wrapped the walls of the apartment. And then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first, they seemed white and slender angels who would save me. But then there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill as if electrocuted, while the angel forms became meaningless specters, and I saw that they would be of no help. And then there stole into my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently, but just as my spirit came to entertain it, the judges vanished, as if magically from before me. The candles sank into nothing, all sensations swallowed up as if in a mad rushing descent into Hades. Then silence and stillness. What of my consciousness remained I cannot define or describe, yet all was not lost in the deepest slumber. No, in delirium, or in death, even in the grave, all is not lost. In returning to life from the swoon, there are 2 stages. First, that of the spiritual sense. Secondly, that of the physical existence. Amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of my soul, there have been shadows of memory, of tall figures that lifted and carried me in silence, down, down, still down, until the hideous dizziness of the descent oppressed me. Then comes a sense of sudden motionlessness, as if the ghastly train that carried me had outrun, in their descent, the limits of the limitless. After this, there was flatness and dampness, and then all is madness, the madness of a memory among forbidden things. Very suddenly there came back to my soul the tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of beating. Then a pause in which all is blank, then again sound, and a tingling sensation pervading my frame. Then very suddenly shuddering terror, and earnest endeavor to comprehend my true state. Then a strong desire to lapse into unconsciousness. Then a rushing revival of soul and a successful effort to move. And now a full memory of the trial, of the judges, of the draperies, the sentence, the sickness, and the swoon. I lay upon my back, unbound. So far I had not opened my eyes. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. At length, with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts, then, were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. I still lay quietly, and brought to mind the proceedings, attempting to deduce my condition. It appeared to me that a very long interval of time had since elapsed since the sentencing. But where and in what state was I? Had I been sent to the dungeon to await the next sacrifice, which would not take place for many months? This could not be. I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move further. Perspiration burst from every pore and in big beads upon my brow. I cautiously moved forward, arms extended, eyes straining from their sockets. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness. Perhaps mine was not the most hideous of fates. My outstretched hands at length encountered some obstruction. It was a wall, seemingly of stone, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it up. This process, however, afforded me no means of guessing the dimensions of my dungeon, as I could circle round and back to the point from where I set out without being aware of the fact. I sought the knife in my pocket, but it was gone. My clothes had been exchanged for a coarse robe. I had thought of forcing the blade into some crevice of the wall to identify my point of departure. I tore a part of the hem from my robe and placed it at full length and at right angles to the wall. In groping my way around the prison, I couldn't fail to encounter the fabric upon completing my circuit. At least I thought. But I had not counted on the extent of the dungeon, or my own weakness. I staggered onward for some time when I stumbled and fell. My excessive fatigue overtook me as I lay, and soon I slept. Upon awaking and stretching, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher with water. I ate and drank ravenously. Then I resumed my tour, and at last came upon the fabric from the robe. I had counted 52 paces before I fell, and 48 upon resuming my walk when I arrived at the rag. There were 100 paces then, and I presumed the dungeon to be 50 yards in circumference. I had met, however, many angles in the wall, and thus could form no guess at the shape of the vault. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the enclosure. At first I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor was treacherous with slime. I had taken some 10 or 12 paces, when the torn hem of my robe tangled between my legs, and I fell violently on my face. My chin rested upon the floor, but my lips touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining. I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment of the wall and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I listened as it dashed against the sides of the void in its descent. Then there was a sullen plunge into water. At the same moment there came from overhead the sound of a door opening and closing rapidly, while a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and faded away. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall. In other times I might have had the courage to end my misery at once with a plunge into the abyss, but now I was the veriest of cowards. At length again I slumbered. Upon arousing, I found again by my side bread and water as before. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel in one gulp. It must have been drugged, for at once deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted I know not, but when I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. In the size of the prison I had been greatly mistaken. The whole circuit of its walls did not exceed 25 yards. The truth flashed upon me. In my first attempt at exploration when I fell, I must have been within a pace or two of the fabric. I then slept, and upon awaking I returned to my steps, thus doubling the circuit. My confusion of mind prevented me from observing that I began my tour with the wall on my left and ended it with the wall to my right. I had been deceived too in respect to the shape of the enclosure. The angles were simply those of a few slight niches at odd intervals. The general shape of the prison was square. What I had taken for stone now seemed to be iron, in huge plates, rudely smothered in hideous and repulsive devices, figures of menacing creatures, with skeleton forms and other fearful images. I now noticed that the floor was of stone. In the center yawned the circular pit whose jaws I had narrowly escaped. All this I saw by much effort, for my condition had greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back, at full length, on a low framework of wood, securely bound by a long strap which passed about my limbs and body, leaving only my head and my left arm, to such extent that I could, with much exertion, supply myself with meat from the dish on the floor. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been removed. I was consumed with intolerable thirst. Looking up, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead and constructed like the walls. One of its panels riveted my whole attention. It was painted with the figure of time as he is commonly represented, but he held the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. When I gazed directly upward, for its position was immediately over my own, I fancied that I saw it in motion. Its sweep was brief and slow. I watched somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. A slight noise attracted my notice, and looking to the floor, I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the well which lay just to my right. They came in troops, with ravenous eyes, allured by the scent of the meat, and it required much effort to scare them away. It might have been a half an hour, perhaps even an hour, before I looked again upward. What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased by nearly a yard, and naturally its velocity was also much greater. Its lower end was shaped like a crescent of gleaming steel, about a foot across from tip to tip, with the points curving upward. The edge was as sharp as a razor and appeared solid and heavy, narrowing from the blade into a broad, sturdy structure above. It was attached to a heavy brass rod, and the entire machine hissed as it sliced through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me. The plunge into the pit I had avoided by the merest of accidents. Having failed to fall, it was no part of the demon plan to hurl me into the abyss, and thus a different destruction awaited me. Inch by inch, line by line, with a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down and still down it came. Days passed before it swept so closely over me as to fan with its sour breath. I prayed for a more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful blade. And then I fell suddenly calm and lay smiling at the glittering death as a child at some rare bauble. I swooned again, and upon my recovery I felt sick and weak. With painful effort I outstretched my left arm and took possession of the small remnant which had been spared by the rats. As I put it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. Yet what business had I with hope? The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would fray my robe, then return and repeat its operations again and again. Down steadily it crept, to the right, to the left, far and wide, with the shriek of a damned spirit, to my heart with the pace of a snail. Down, relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously to free my left arm. Could I have broken the fastenings, I would have attempted to seize the pendulum. I might as well have attempted to arrest an avalanche. Down, unceasingly, inevitably down. I gasped at each vibration. I shrunk at every sweep. My eyes followed its whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. I quivered to think of the glistening axe upon my chest. Some 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe, and for the first time in perhaps days, I thought. It now occurred to me that the bandage which enveloped me was unique. The first stroke of the razor would detach it so that it might be unwound by my left hand. I elevated my head as to obtain a view of my breast. The fabric wrapped my limbs and body in all directions, except in the path of the blade. For many hours, my immediate vicinity had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as they waited to make me their prey. They had devoured, in spite of all my efforts to prevent them, all but a small remnant of the contents of the dish. In their voracity, the vermin frequently fastened their sharp fangs in my fingers. With the particles of the oily meat which now remained, I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could reach. Then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first the animals were startled by the conclusion of movement. They shrank back. Many sought the well, but this was only for a moment. 1 or 2 of the boldest leapt upon the framework, which seemed the signal for a general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops, and leapt in hundreds upon my person. The movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with the bandage. They pressed, they swarmed, they writhed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. Disgust swelled my bosom, and chilled with a heavy clamminess my heart. Yet I felt that soon the struggle would be over. Plainly I perceived the loosening of the bandage, and with a more than human resolution, I lay still. Then I was free, and the robe hung in ribbons from my body. But the stroke of the pendulum had cut through the linen. Twice again it swung, and a sharp pain shot through every nerve. But the moment of my escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand the rats hurried away, and cautious, sidelong, shrinking and slow, I slid beyond the reach of the blade. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and it was drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around the barriers that hemmed me in. I became aware, for the first time, of the origin of the low light which illuminated the cell. It proceeded from a crack about 1/2 inch in width, extending the base of the walls, which thus appeared completely separated from the floor. I endeavored in vain to look through this opening. As I arose from the attempt, demon eyes, of a wild and ghastly vivacity, glared upon me in 1,000 directions where none had been visible before, and a suffocating odor pervaded the prison. I panted. I gasped for breath. I shrank from the glowing metal to the center of the cell. Amid the thought of fiery destruction, the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like balm. I rushed to the deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below. Yet, for a wild moment, I refused to comprehend what I saw. Then it wrestled its way into my soul. Oh, any horror but this! I rushed with a shriek from the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased, and again I looked up, shuddering at the next change in the cell. The room had been square. Now 2 of its iron angles were rounded. "Death," I said. "Any death but that of the pit." Flatter and flatter grew the prison, with a rapidity that left no time for contemplation. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressed me onward. At length from my writhing body there was no longer an inch of foothold. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul erupted in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. Unable to bear the sight, I turned my eyes away. Then came the sound of 1,000 thunders, and the fiery walls surged outward. An arm reached out and caught me just as I began to fall, fainting into the pit. There was a blaring blast of many trumpets, and the hum of human voices. The oppressors had been overthrown, and their reign of terror was at an end.